Tonight, we're going to talk about a war that by all rights should have erased the United States from the map for good. Before we deep dive into the history, my name is Boris, and I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what was the best part of your day? Feel free to share it in the comments below. And if you find comfort or curiosity in these calm history journeys, consider giving the video a like and maybe even subscribing for more. Now, settle in. Let's drift gently into the past. Forget the tidy, heroic stories you learned in school. The truth is, the American Civil War was a conflict that didn't just split a country in half. It tore families apart, shattered an economy, and forced brother to kill brother for the very soul of a nation. The death toll was catastrophic, with modern estimates putting it somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 soldiers. That's more than in all other American wars combined. The scars from that kind of loss don't just fade away. But here's what nobody tells you. The Civil War wasn't just a handful of famous battles. To really understand how a nation built on the idea of liberty could turn on itself in such a spectacular, bloody fashion, you have to look at the rot that set in long before the first shot was fired. This isn't just a story about generals and armies. This is the story of political gambles, compromises that were doomed from the start, and the festering wound of slavery that finally blew up in everyone's face. This is the entire story of how the United States was nearly destroyed and how, from the ashes, it was forced to figure out what it actually stood for. The problem started right at the beginning. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence made the bold claim that all men are created equal. A beautiful idea. The bad news? The man who wrote it, Thomas Jefferson, owned hundreds of slaves. This was America's original sin, a nation of freedom built on the backs of people in chains. It was a contradiction the founders knew was a problem, so they did what politicians do best. They kicked the can down the road for someone else to deal with. For decades, this shaky foundation held, but two Americas were growing, and they were growing apart. The North was building factories. Its economy ran on wages, its cities swelled, and it was home to a loud and growing abolitionist movement that called slavery what it was, a moral crime. The South, meanwhile, was a world away. Its entire reality, its money, its social ladder, its way of life, was chained to an agricultural system powered by slavery. King Cotton wasn't just a phrase. The crop produced by enslaved people fueled the economy of the entire country and even the world. Southern leaders weren't just making excuses for slavery. They were championing it as a positive good, better than the wage slavery they claimed existed up north. This deep divide could only last as long as the political power was perfectly balanced. But one thing made that impossible. America kept getting bigger. Every time a new territory was added to the map, one explosive question had to be answered: slave or free? This wasn't just about morals, it was a street fight for political control. Every new state meant 2 more senators and more votes in Congress. Both sides knew that whoever controlled Congress would decide the country's future. So they compromised. They built a series of political dams to hold back the flood. The first was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The good news? It let Missouri in as a slave state while adding Maine as a free state, keeping the Senate balanced. The bad news? It drew a line across the country, the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel, banning slavery north of it and allowing it south of it. It seemed like a fix, but old Thomas Jefferson saw right through it. He called it a fire bell in the night, a warning that the real problem hadn't been solved, just put on pause. 30 years later, the fire bell rang again. After the Mexican-American War, the US grabbed a huge chunk of new land, including California, which wanted in as a free state. The resulting compromise of 1850 was a desperate mess. California got to be free, but to keep the South happy, The deal included a monstrous new Fugitive Slave Act. This law forced people in the North, even in states where slavery was illegal, to help catch escaped slaves. Now, you weren't just a bystander, you were a potential accomplice. The compromise didn't bring peace, it brought the horror of slavery right to the North's front door. If the dams were leaking before, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 blew them wide open. To clear the way for a new railroad, Senator Stephen Douglas proposed a new idea: popular sovereignty. Let the settlers in the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska vote on slavery for themselves. What could go wrong? In practice, it was an invitation to war. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers poured into Kansas, ready for a fight. What they got was Bleeding Kansas, a gruesome preview of the main event. Abolitionists and border ruffians murdered each other. Towns were burned. The violence even spilled onto the floor of the U.S. Senate, where Congressman Preston Brooks beat Senator Charles Sumner nearly to death with a cane for giving an anti-slavery speech. In the North, Sumner was a martyr. In the South, people mailed Brooks new canes to show their support. The time for talking was over. Then, in 1857, the Supreme Court decided to pour gasoline on the fire. The case was Dred Scott v. Sandford. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, had been taken to live on free soil and sued for his freedom. The court's decision was a bombshell. First, it declared that African Americans, enslaved or free, were not citizens and could never be. They had, in the infamous words of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Second, the court declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. Congress had no power to ban slavery in any territory. The ruling essentially meant there was no such thing as free soil. It suggested that slavery was legal everywhere. The decade ended with one last desperate act. In 1859, an abolitionist named John Brown, a man who believed he was God's own avenging angel, decided violence was the only path left. He led a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to start a massive slave uprising. The raid failed. Brown was captured and hanged. But he became a symbol of the nation's irreversible divide. In the South, he was a terrorist. But to many in the North, he was a martyr who died for a righteous cause. The country was now so broken that one man could be a demon and a saint at the same time. By 1860, the old political world was dead. The Whig Party had torn itself apart over slavery. In its place, a new party rose, the Republicans. Their main goal wasn't to end slavery everywhere, but to stop it from spreading 1 inch further west. To the South, this was a death sentence. If they couldn't expand, they would be drowned out politically, and they believed it was only a matter of time before the North dismantled their entire world. The presidential election of 1860 was the spark. The Democratic Party split in two, a northern candidate and a southern one. Into this chaos stepped the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was seen as a moderate. He promised not to touch slavery where it already existed. But that detail didn't matter anymore. In the South, he was the boogeyman, the black Republican, whose election would mean the end of their way of life. Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state. The message was clear. The South had lost control of the government. They didn't stick around to see what would happen. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina walked out of the Union. Soon, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. In February 1861, they formed their own country, the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. When Lincoln took office, he inherited a shattered nation. In his first speech, he tried to be both gentle and firm. He promised again not to interfere with slavery, but he made it clear that no state had the right to just leave the Union. "We are not enemies, but friends," he pleaded. But passion was in charge now. The final standoff came at Fort Sumter, a federal fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. It was now in the middle of a foreign country. Lincoln decided to send a ship with food and supplies, but no guns. The choice was now in the hands of the Confederacy. Let the ship through and look weak, or open fire and start a war. They chose war. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire. The fort surrendered 34 hours later. The attack sent a bolt of electricity through the North. Any hope for compromise was gone. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to crush the rebellion, and the response was overwhelming. But his call to arms forced the last few slave states to pick a side. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina chose the Confederacy. The lines were drawn. The war was on. In the spring of 1861, both sides were dangerously optimistic. Northerners thought one big battle would do it. Southerners thought the Yankees would lose their nerve. They were both horribly wrong. The first Battle of Bull Run was the bloody wake-up call. Washington socialites came with picnic baskets to watch a glorious victory and instead saw a panicked Union retreat. This wasn't going to be a short war. The North's strategy was the Anaconda Plan, a naval blockade to choke the South's trade, a push to control the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy in two, and a final campaign to capture the capital, Richmond. The South's plan was simpler. Survive. Fight a defensive war, wear the North down, and pray that a big victory would convince Britain or France to help. The war had two main fronts. The Eastern Theater, mostly in Virginia, was a disaster for the Union. Robert E. Lee and his army of Northern Virginia were brilliant, consistently beating a rotating cast of failed Union generals. Lincoln kept firing them, but no one could seem to stop Lee. The one big exception was the Battle of Antietam in 1862. Lee invaded the North, and the two armies met in the single bloodiest day in American history. It was technically a draw, but Lee was forced to retreat. While the East was a meat grinder, things were different in the Western Theater. Here, the Union had Ulysses S. Grant. Grant wasn't flashy, but he understood one simple thing. You win wars by destroying the other guy's army. He started capturing key forts and rivers, pushing deeper into the South. Antietam, bloody as it was, gave Lincoln the political cover he needed. He knew that just putting the country back together wasn't enough. The cancer of slavery had to be removed. On September 22, 1862, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Let's be clear about what this did and didn't do. It didn't immediately free a single slave in the loyal border states. Critics pointed this out. But what it did do was change the entire game. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now a war to end slavery. It also officially opened the door for black men to fight. Nearly 200,000 would join the Union Army and Navy. This was now their war of liberation. If you're finding this grim look at history fascinating, do me a favor and hit that like button. It lets me know we should do more of these deep dives, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. The summer of 1863 was the ultimate turning point. Lee, feeling unstoppable, invaded the North again. He met the Union Army near a small town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For 3 days, they tore each other apart. The final desperate gamble was a massive Confederate assault called Pickett's Charge. It was a suicidal disaster. Lee's army was broken. He limped back to Virginia and would never launch a major attack again. The very next day, July 4th, hundreds of miles away, Grant captured the fortress of Vicksburg, Mississippi. The Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River. The Confederacy was cut in two. Gettysburg and Vicksburg were the 1-2 punch from which the South could never recover. The war wasn't over, but the end was in sight. In 1864, Lincoln finally found his guy. He promoted Grant to command all Union armies. Grant's strategy was simple and horrifyingly brutal. He knew the Union had more men and more guns, and he was going to use them. He would attack Lee relentlessly, no matter the cost. What followed was the Overland Campaign, a 40-day slugfest. In battles like the Wilderness and Cold Harbor, Grant threw his men at Lee's defenses again and again. Unlike the generals before him, Grant never retreated. After a brutal fight, he just kept pushing south. The casualties were staggering, earning him the nickname the Butcher. But the truth is, it worked. He was bleeding Lee's army dry, and Lee had no more men to spare. While Grant pinned Lee down in Virginia, General William Tecumseh Sherman was unleashed on the West. In September 1864, he captured Atlanta, a critical railroad and industrial hub. The news was a massive boost to the North, and it came just in time. The war was deeply unpopular, and Lincoln was facing a tough re-election against a former general who promised to negotiate peace. The fall of Atlanta proved the war was winnable, and Lincoln won in a landslide. Then Sherman began his infamous March to the Sea. Believing that the South's will to fight came from its people, Sherman decided to wage war on their morale. His army cut a 60-mile-wide path of destruction from Atlanta to Savannah, burning farms and tearing up railroads. He wanted to make Georgia howl and show the Southern people their government couldn't protect them. It was total war. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Grant finally broke through Lee's defenses at Petersburg. Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell on April 3rd. Lee's army, now just a starving remnant of what it once was on the run. Grant's army chased them down and cut off their escape. On April 9th, 1865, at a small village called Appomattox Courthouse, Lee knew it was over. He met Grant to surrender. Lee showed up in a perfect dress uniform. Grant was in a muddy private's coat. Grant's terms were generous. The Confederate soldiers wouldn't be prisoners. They just had to put down their guns, promise to go home, and they could even keep their horses for the spring planting. It was a moment of grace, the first step toward putting a broken country back together. The war was over. The celebrations in the North didn't last long. 5 days after the surrender, on April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was at Ford's Theater when an actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth shot him in the back of the head. He died the next morning. The assassination was a national catastrophe. It stole the one man whose wisdom and compassion might have guided the nation through what came next. His plan was for a peace with malice toward none, with charity for all. Now, the job of rebuilding the nation, reconstruction, was in other hands. The cost of the war was immense. The Southern economy was vaporized. But it had answered 2 questions. The country was one nation, indivisible, and slavery was dead. But it raised new, harder questions. What was the place of 4 million newly freed African Americans? How do you bring the defeated South back into a country it tried to destroy? The era that followed, Reconstruction, was America's first shot at answering those questions. And it was a story of incredible progress and heartbreaking failure. 3 new amendments were added to the Constitution. The 13th abolished slavery. The 14th granted citizenship and equal protection to everyone born in the U.S. The 15th gave black men the right to vote. For a minute, it looked like a real interracial democracy might actually happen. Black men were voting and holding office, but the backlash was swift and savage. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror to re-establish white supremacy. By 1877, the North had lost its commitment, Reconstruction was abandoned, and the promises of equality were betrayed. the South descended into the long, dark night of Jim Crow segregation, which would last for another century. The Civil War, then, was both an end and a beginning. It settled the question of slavery and secession. But the struggle to fulfill the promise of freedom and equality for every citizen, the unfinished work that Lincoln talked about at Gettysburg, is a fight that continues to this day. It is the defining chapter of the American story, a brutal, transformative ordeal that reminds us how fragile a nation can be and how high the cost is to hold it together. If you want to see more deep dives into the events that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, and let us know in the comments what piece of history you'd like us to cover next. For most of us, the story of America has a hard start date, 1492. It's the one we all learned in school, the one everything else seems to flow from. But here's the thing about that date. It's not the beginning. It's an interruption. It's a single violent moment in a story that was already 20,000 years old. Before Columbus, a completely different story unfolded across the Americas, a story of massive civilizations and a diversity of cultures that shaped an entire hemisphere. This is that story. Now let's be clear. To tell the entire story of any people is impossible. The history of Native Americans isn't one straight line. It's a messy, tangled thing, woven from thousands of different nations, languages, and lives. It's a story of incredible achievement and almost unimaginable loss. But it's also a story of survival that is still going on. So what we're going to do is walk through this history, from its deepest roots in a world of ice to the living cultures of right now. We'll get rid of the myth of an empty wilderness and replace it with the reality of a continent that was anything but. This isn't just about what was lost, it's about what was here, what endured, and what's still being fought for. All right, let's begin. Our story starts in a world so cold that the oceans shrank, uncovering a bridge of land between what we now call Siberia and Alaska. This was Beringia, and it wasn't some narrow, icy path. It was a massive, habitable subcontinent. It was across this land that the first chapters of human history in the Americas were written. For a long time, the accepted theory was pretty neat and tidy. Around 13,000 years ago, hunters followed mammoths across this bridge. We call them the Clovis people, named for the unique stone spear points they left behind, and for decades they were considered the first Americans. Case closed. But history is rarely that simple, and recent discoveries have completely dynamited that timeline. In White Sands National Park, New Mexico, they found fossilized human footprints left in the mud of an ancient lake. These weren't the tracks of hunters. They belonged to teenagers and children just walking along the shore. And here's the kicker. Radiocarbon dating of seeds buried with the prints showed they were made between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. That one discovery proved people were living in the heart of North America during the peak of the last ice age, when Canada was buried under miles of ice. So how did they get there? If the ice sheets blocked the way, a land-only migration seems impossible. This gives a lot more weight to another theory, the Kelp Highway, the idea that many of the first people didn't walk, they paddled. They were maritime explorers in small boats, following the coast south, living off the rich kelp forests just offshore. It would have been a highway of resources, free of ice, allowing people to get deep into the hemisphere far earlier, maybe as far back as 30,000 years ago. A timeline that, actually aligns with the oral histories of many indigenous peoples who say they've been here forever. These first people, the Paleo-Indians, spread out and adapted. As the Ice Age ended and the mammoths died off, they developed new tools to hunt new animals. Over thousands of years, they settled every corner of the continents, from the Arctic tundra to the deserts of the Southwest. And the old image you might have in your head of purely nomadic people just wandering around, You can throw that out. At a site in Louisiana called Watson Break, archaeologists found a complex of 11 earthen mounds built 5,400 years ago. At Poverty Point, an even more massive complex of mounds and ridges was built 3,500 years ago, a project that would have required the labor of thousands. These weren't just campsites. This was the start of sedentary life. This was large-scale engineering. They were building civilizations. About 9,000 years ago, in the highlands of Mexico, people started messing around with a wild grass called teosinte, and through centuries of cultivation, they engineered it into one of the most important crops in human history: maize, corn. And that changed everything. In Mesoamerica, it fueled the rise of the Olmec, the Maya, and the Aztec Empire with its incredible city of Tenochtitlan. But those seeds of civilization also spread north into what is now the United States. In the Ohio River Valley, cultures like the Adena and Hopewell built massive ceremonial mounds, some shaped like animals. And the artifacts found inside them, copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rockies, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, tell us they were part of continent-spanning trade networks. The absolute peak of this was the Mississippian culture, which emerged around 800 CE. Its capital was the city of Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis. At its height, Cahokia had a population that may have topped 20,000 people. For perspective, that was larger than London at the time. The city was built around a huge plaza and over 100 mounds. The biggest, Monk's Mound, is a 10-story tall platform with a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, all built by hand with baskets of dirt. Cahokia was a true city with a powerful chief, priests, artisans, and a complex understanding of astronomy marked by a series of wooden circles, a wood henge, that tracked the solstices. Meanwhile, out in the desert southwest, different societies were taking shape. The ancestral Puebloans built stone cities into cliffs and on top of mesas. In Chaco Canyon, they constructed enormous great houses with hundreds of rooms, all connected by a mysterious network of roads hundreds of miles long, and they did all this with no wheels or draft animals. Down in Arizona, the Hohokam engineered massive irrigation canals, some over 20 miles long, to turn the desert into farmland. So, no, pre-Columbian America was not an empty wilderness. It was a continent of cities, nations, and empires, home to millions of people. A complex human world on the edge of a violent interruption. Now, to speak of Native Americans as one group is a profound oversimplification. It's like saying Europeans. By 1492, the land north of Mexico was home to somewhere between 7 and 10 million people speaking hundreds of languages. In the northeast, you had powerful alliances like the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy. Their great law of peace was so sophisticated it would later influence thinkers like Benjamin Franklin. Their society was matrilineal. Lineage passed through the mother, and the clan mothers held the real political power, choosing and deposing the male chiefs. In the southeast, you had the descendants of the Mississippian city builders, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and others. They lived in large, organized agricultural towns. Out on the Great Plains, the iconic image of the nomadic bison hunter on horseback is a relatively recent thing. It only happened after the Spanish introduced horses. For centuries before that, many plains peoples, like the Mandan and Hidatsa, were farmers living in permanent earth lodge villages along the rivers. They were at the center of a massive trade network. Some archaeologists even speculate that a forgotten nation, Quivira, may have been a major political entity in modern-day Kansas, a collection of large towns whose population could have rivaled some European city-states, though the scale of it is still debated. In the southwest, the descendants of the Puebloans, the Hopi, Zuni, and others, continued to live in their adobe villages, their lives governed by sophisticated dry farming techniques, and a deeply complex cosmology. And up on the Pacific Northwest coast, the sheer bounty of the ocean and forests allowed for large, wealthy, stratified societies to exist without any agriculture at all. Peoples like the Tlingit and Haida are known for their massive cedar plank houses and towering totem poles, which were family crests and historical records. Social status was maintained through huge ceremonies called potlatches, where chiefs would give away or even destroy enormous amounts of wealth just to prove their power. This is just a tiny snapshot. From the Arctic to the desert, North America was a continent of nations. And for all of them, land wasn't a commodity. It was a shared, sacred source of life. And here's the kicker. This worldview, so completely different from that of the Europeans, would become the central point of conflict for the next 500 years. In October 1492, 3 Spanish ships landed on an island in the Bahamas. For Columbus, it was the discovery of a new world. For the millions of people already there, it was the beginning of the apocalypse. The most devastating weapon the Europeans brought wasn't the sword or the gun. It was germs. The peoples of the Americas had been geographically isolated for millennia and had no immunity to smallpox, measles, or the flu. These diseases tore through the continent, often moving faster than the Europeans themselves passed along those ancient trade routes. Entire societies vanished. Some historians estimate that up to 90% of the indigenous population died in the first 150 years. It was one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. As the colonial powers scrambled for control, they brought a relentless hunger for land and resources. The Spanish pushed up from the south, hunting for gold and souls to convert. The French came for the fur trade in the north, forming alliances and intensifying old rivalries. The English arrived on the Atlantic coast, not just to trade, but to settle. And they needed land. This was a period of constant resistance. Native peoples weren't passive victims. They played diplomatic games, formed their own alliances, and adopted European technologies like horses and guns to defend themselves. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, led by a Tewa man named Popeye, was so successful it drove the Spanish completely out of New Mexico for 12 years. But after the United States was formed, the pressure got worse. Fueled by manifest destiny, the convenient belief that they had a divine right to the entire continent, the U.S. government began a formal policy of removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the forced relocation of the Cherokee, Choctaw, and other southeastern nations to Indian territory. The Cherokees' brutal march west, where thousands died, is now known as the Trail of Tears. This cycle repeated across the West for the rest of the 19th century. Treaties were made and then broken the moment gold or good land was found. By the end of the century, the Indian Wars were over, and the remaining native populations were forced onto reservations. But the assault wasn't just physical. With tribes confined, the U.S. government shifted its policy from removal to forced assimilation. The goal now was to destroy native cultures entirely. The Dawes Act of 1887 broke up tribal lands, and the most insidious tool was the network of off-reservation boarding schools. Children were taken from their families and forbidden from speaking their languages or practicing their religions. The philosophy was stated plainly by the founder of one school: kill the Indian in him and save the man. They weren't hiding it. It was a policy of systematic, cultural destruction. So by the dawn of the 20th century, things looked about as bleak as they could get. Populations were shattered, lands were gone, and cultures were under official attack. But the story doesn't end there. That assimilation policy, it backfired. In trying to erase dozens of distinct cultures, the government inadvertently forged a new pan-Indian identity based on shared experience and resistance. By the 1930s, even the government had to admit its policies were a disaster. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 ended allotment and allowed for the re-establishment of tribal governments. It was a flawed law, but it was a start. After World War II, activism exploded. Veterans came home from fighting for freedom overseas and were determined to find it at home. The American Indian Movement, AIM, founded in 1968, used direct action to force the country to pay attention. The occupation of Alcatraz, the protest at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the armed standoff at Wounded Knee in 1973. These were powerful acts that put treaty rights and sovereignty in the national spotlight. And it worked. The Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 gave tribal governments more control over their own affairs. Court cases reaffirmed treaty rights. Tribes started building their own schools, colleges, and police forces. Today, the story is one of stark contrasts. Many communities are still dealing with the deep wounds of that history. Poverty, health disparities, and underfunded schools are serious problems. The crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women is a horrific reminder of ongoing systemic violence. And yet, right alongside those struggles, there is a powerful story of renewal. Language immersion programs are bringing back languages from the brink of extinction. Traditional ceremonies and agricultural practices are being revived. Tribal governments are sophisticated political players, and native voices are more prominent in art, film, and literature than ever before, finally telling their own stories. From the fight to protect water at Standing Rock to the movement to repatriate ancestral remains, Indigenous peoples are actively shaping their own futures. So, that's the story, a narrative that covers at least 20,000 years. It moves from the Ice Age, through the rise of great civilizations, into a few centuries of brutal disruption, and ends with a struggle for survival and sovereignty that is happening right now as we speak. The history of Native Americans isn't a closed chapter in a textbook. It's a living history, and their resilience, in the face of centuries of policies designed to make them disappear, is a testament to the strength of their cultures and their connection to this land. Thanks a lot for watching. That's all for tonight. Stay safe, get some sleep,